All right, it's that time again. Time to talk this go around about April anticipated releases. And in an ongoing trend, I have not edited down this list maybe as much as I should have. So this is kind of a broad swath of things I am even a little bit interested in. That being said, even though it's a pretty extensive list in terms of talking about it today, it is not exhaustive. So as usual, go ahead and tell me what you're excited about below, whether it's covered here or not, because we're trying to spread word about books we're excited about. Additionally, any comments, likes, new subscribers are greatly appreciated, but I also greatly appreciate those of you who are coming along for this ride every month. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump in to the releases for April 4th. The first I'm excited about, I believe, is a debut, and it is Blood Debts by Terry J. Benton Walker. And it follows twins in New Orleans, and they are heirs to a magical dynasty that has been overthrown after a tragedy involving a murder and a lynching and massacre that came about. And in the wake of this kind of shifting of power, the twins have reacted in much different ways. Christina has basically given up magic, and Clement is really clinging to it. And this has driven a wedge between them when they were at one time inseparable, but they are faced with kind of this lingering mystery around what happened and who is trying to bring their family down. And when they're given the opportunity to solve this mystery amidst heightening tensions between the city's magical and non-magical communities, they have to band together to figure out what is going on. So this feels like it's going to have a lot of atmosphere as well as some really lovable and engaging protagonists. And I'm very excited to see what kind of world this creates. The cover is also giving me very much a 20s feel, so I will be very interested to see if that is in the book itself as well. So very much looking forward to this. I love a little magic with my mystery, and I've been hearing good things about this one. And then we have Queen Bee by Emily Howard, which I believe is a young adult historical romance, and it follows a young girl coming back into society after having been betrayed by her best friend years ago over a guy. This is a little bit of a pressure point for me. Well, pressure point might not be the right wording, but 3 years ago, based on the timeline in the blurb, the girls would have been like 15-ish. So it's kind of right on that precipice of believability for me. But our young protagonist, also kind of on the precipice of believability, comes back into society and positions herself as this wealthy heiress because she has been shunned, cast out of society, living in the countryside for years. The believability here is if she was, I guess she wouldn't have technically been out in society within the world of the book. I mean, I don't know, I haven't read it completely, so not everyone would recognize her, but there is surely going to be someone that would recognize her, especially because the plot of the book seems to be her coming back in contact with this boy, I believe, who caused the fallout in the first place. The reason I'm intrigued, even amidst the potential believability hurdle, is one, it is a young adult historical romance, but two, something about the blurb feels a little Count of Monte Cristo to me. So we'll see if it aligns itself more overtly with the Count of Monte Cristo, and if it's able to overcome that kind of suspension of disbelief that it feels like it's going to need based on the blurb. But definitely one I have my eye on nonetheless. And then we have Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, which I believe is a young adult title. This is of course the author of A River Enchanted, which was one of my favorite books of last year. I still need to read A Fire Endless and am really hoping to get to that this month because I had put it off based on the HarperCollins strike and wanting to be able to talk about it. So based on my love of A River Enchanted, I am definitely intrigued by this, especially because it still feels like it's going to be leaning in to that romantic tension of enemies to lovers type dynamic. This takes place in a kind of magical world, according to the blurb, and a magical world where there is a great war going on. So I definitely have a kind of sense, I'm getting a little bit more World War I from the blurb, but I could be proven wrong there. And it does feel like it's going to be a fantasy world of some kind, but I think very much a mirror of our own experience. And I am not a person who inherently gravitates toward World War I, World War II narratives. There has to be a little bit more going on for me usually, or some other angle. And there are admittedly, I think, a couple of books this month that fit the bill there, including this one. So our protagonist here is a reporter, and she has a brother on the front lines, and she gets sent with her rival at the paper she works at to basically report from the front. And the blurb leads me to believe that there's already been some kind of connection between these two that has been fermented before they're sent off, and it's about whether this connection can withstand the strain of the war and what they're going to see. So while the setting of this is definitely going to be different from A River Enchanted, I'm really intrigued to see if the lyrical kind of style is still at play here. There was a great sense of longing inherent in A River Enchanted, this kind of sense of spareness, and I think that that will translate really well if implemented in this kind of narrative as well. It's obviously going to be a different shade of that, but I think that it would still serve this story, especially if we're dealing with the kind of like disillusionment and kind of reconfiguring caused by the World War. And I think that I might be entering more of a place where I'm willing to engage with those ideas and that kind of disillusionment. Every day I live in this world, I get a little bit closer to actually understanding data, and my friends, I don't think that's a good thing. So we'll see what this gives us, but it mentions hope and heartbreak and the power of love. So selfishly, hopefully, hope is the kind of ending sentiment there, but it is also listed as a potential series, so I'm not gonna get my hopes up too much for that hope, and then immediately proving myself a liar on the World War I, World War II narratives, except not really at the same time, because there is definitely a twist here. We have The Last Heir to Blackwood Library by Hester Fox. I have not read any Hester Fox, but have had her books on my list for a while, especially because she seems to write about witches. And this definitely feels like a similar thematic vein, but doesn't seem like it's going to be about witches. So it's following Ivy, a young woman who has been disillusioned by World War I. So we're seeing the kind of fallout of that change and that kind of lasting trauma. And in the wake of this, she has unexpectedly inherited a title and is off to the Yorkshire moors. And she really doesn't know anything about this estate, but it does come with a library, even as the servants kind of warn her off of this place. And there is some kind of secrecy around this library and a potential manuscript that lives in the library. So amidst more mainstream and esoteric texts, in this library lives this kind of rumor of ghosts and some story about the former owners, and there are whispers and we're on the moors, so there's this kind of gothic sense to everything. And I think if you've been with me a second, you'll recognize that I really gravitate toward gothics. Additionally, we have a protagonist here who has to get to the bottom of this to kind of understand her own story. The kind of whispering servants bit of the blurb makes me think a little bit of Rebecca. I mean, obviously not in any real tangible way, but just the echoes of it. And we love some echoes. So between the setting and the feel of everything, I'm very intrigued. And even if we don't have witches inherently in the blurb, who can resist a library, especially a kind of magical, potentially sentient library? I'm not going to hold my breath too much, but there's that possibility. I'm reading between the lines in the blurb, so we'll see. But if you also like gothics, I definitely think this would potentially be up your alley as well. And then because I really think I'm going to be rooted in magic this month, Spellbound by F.T. Lukens. This is the newest book from the author of In Deeper Waters, and So This Is Ever After. I personally only read In Deeper Waters so far, but this follows a sorcerer's apprentice yearning for a connection to the magical world, even as he is brought in a potentially contraband device that he is having to hide, and at the same time he's bonding with the apprentice of a rival until his contraband device is discovered and his sorcerer is taken away. And in wake of this, he has to band together with this other apprentice whose sorcerer has also been attacked. So lots of magic and shifting allegiances, and I am sure a little bit of romance, but this looks like a lot of fun. And then shifting away from magic for a moment with Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang, which really feels like it's going to interrogate our kind of modern obsession with appearance and beauty. And I think it's going to be perfectly positioned, especially around some of these kind of viral conversations we've been having around particularly Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop, because our protagonist in this book is a talented musician who has to abandon her career after her parents are in an accident, and she ends up working at this really prestigious wellness and beauty company and getting kind of roped in to this culture and showing kind of the sinister side of this culture, though for me the sinister side is kind of right on its face in a lot of ways too. But I'm really excited to see how this kind of twists. What the blurb specifically mentions our protagonist's belonging in this place, how she becomes intrinsically linked with the owner's niece, and it feels very much like diving into a cult. And having just finished a reread of Cultish and exploring the kind of blurred lines of cult dynamics amidst that train of thought, I think it will be really interesting. It looks on its face like it might might be some mashup of Goop and Nexium. So I'll be really interested to see what it's exploring, what the tone of it is. If we start out with that kind of love bombing, everything looks great on the outside, especially as we are exploring the concept of beauty and kind of twisting that. I think that there is a lot of potential here. I'm also wondering if it will appeal to fans of If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha, which I loved, though obviously from a different angle, but we'll see. And if you're a fan of literary fiction, I definitely think that this is one to have on your radar. And then Anna Maria and the Fox by Liana de la Rosa, which I have heard is perfect for fans of A Caribbean Heiress in Paris, which we know I loved, and is perfect because the sequel to that doesn't come out until next month. But this follows Anna Maria, who is sent to London with her sisters during the French occupation in Mexico, and there she experiences her first kind of taste of freedom out of her father's shadow and catches the eye of Mr. Fox. And Gideon Fox doesn't have time for romance. He has spent his life building up his career and his reputation, and he's now a member of parliament close to his goal of eliminating the Atlantic slave trade. So he is focused on that goal. So we'll see how the happily ever slips in, because this is billed as a romance, and Mr. Fox presumably can't keep Anna Louisa at arm's length forever. However, I guess we'll see how Anna Louisa feels about all of this as well amidst her first taste of real freedom. So we'll see, but happily ever afters are obviously expected. And yes, just to check in, we are still on the 4th. And next up, we have the highly anticipated middle grade debut from Angie Thomas, Nick Blake and the Remarkables, The Manifestor Prophecy. This is, I presume, based on the blurb, going to be perfect for fans of Amari and the Knight Brothers, which is great because those books are not coming out fast enough for me, for sure. So for kids who time works much different for, I can only imagine. So in this book, Nick Blake is a young woman who is a remarkable in an unremarkable world. And she just wants to be a powerful manifestor like her dad. But before he can teach her, he's taken away, accused of a crime that Nick is sure he didn't commit. So she teams up with 2 of her friends in search of this device to help free her father, and presumably also has her pet hellhound along for the ride. So we seemingly have a quest amidst a magical world here. So we'll see how much of that magical world we get to explore and in what way, but I'm willing to bet that Nick Blake and her friends are going to discover a little bit about their powers in their own right. So this sounds like it's going to be perfect for fans of middle grade fantasy, and I'm really excited to see how Thomas continues to explore her voice within different genres. So this is a new direction for her, and I'm really excited to support that direction, while also excited for all of the new readers that are going to get to experience her worlds. So very excited for this one, because especially if she can create such rich, intertwined contemporary worlds, the sky is kind of the limit for fantasy. Because in some ways, I think world building in contemporary is harder. Obviously, there are different obstacles to both, and I'm not saying fantasy world building is easy by any means, but you already have a level expectation of reality within a contemporary setting. So I'm excited to see how the world building is different, if there are similarities. I just think that there are lots of opportunities here, and I'm excited to see what we get. Okay, and then we have Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld, which is a Book of the Month pick, and I believe is being kind of positioned to be a big book going into the summer. I think it's getting a lot of buzz and picking up traction that will kind of carry into the summer months. When people are looking for a beach read, the buzz will already be built up there. Now, as a millennial, there was a solid amount of time. It felt like close to a decade, but at the time, I was young, and as I just said, time worked different, so who knows. But this is the author of Prep, which in the 2000s was everywhere. You could not escape. It felt like that book was on a table at Barnes & Noble forever. You would see Prep, you would see Perks of Being a Wallflower. Now, did I ever read Prep? No, I didn't. I feel like maybe I should, but I just never got around to it. I think I had a secondhand copy at one point. It doesn't matter. But that book was really ubiquitous, and this author is tied to that book in my mind, regardless of whether I've read it or not, because it was such a phenomenon. Now, that being said, another book that this author has written that I haven't read that looms kind of large over this release, all of this preface, I'm sorry, but she wrote Rodham, which was basically Hillary Clinton fan fiction, which now I know that I have personally read books that germ from an idea of real people. I've read The Royal We, which was basically William and Kate fanfiction. Listen, it was a different time. I've read Gabrielle Zevin's Young Jane Young, which was basically Monica Lewinsky fanfiction in some ways. Not to draw too many parallels here, but that book in particular, Rodham, made me kind of go like, it crossed some lines for me in terms of real person fanfiction. I don't read real person fanfiction. Did I when I was 12 and obsessed with Orlando Bloom? Yes, we were all ill-advised at some point. But now it just feels like ethically icky to me, and for her to have written a book that was so blatantly fan fiction in some ways, and I don't have anything against fan fiction, to be clear, but it was a fictionalized account of a real person's life, presumably to my recollection using their real identity, and I don't know, it just felt like a line to me. So all of that to say, that's all kind of sitting in the back of my head when approaching this book and kind of coloring what I'm thinking here. Because there are parts of this blurb that make me go, oh yeah, this is really interesting. And there are parts that I'm kind of reserved on a little bit. And I think that that also could be an indication that this is going to be an excellent conversation starter book, an excellent book club book. But it follows a woman who is a writer for a late night comedy show, and one of her fellow writers, who is presumably, according to the blurb, a little bit of a schlubbier guy potentially, starts dating a famous actress. And our protagonist, Sally, starts this kind of like running gag, poking fun at this phenomenon of like the average looking guy attracting these really glamorous, beautiful women, and how we don't necessarily see it working in reverse until the narrative opens up this potential for reverse. Now, this is called romantic comedy, and it's being billed in kind of that intersection of romantic comedy, romance, chick lit. I feel like personally it's probably going to fall a little bit more chick lit. This feels a little bit more early 2000s, especially because it feels like it is really kind of interrogating some of those residual insecurities from the 2000s, which, to be fair, especially with a lot of these conversations we've seen resurrected along with low-rise jeans, though thankfully not as low-rise as they were in the 2000s, and I will not be jumping on that boat if it ever sails, but it feels a little bit mean-spirited potentially, even if I recognize the insecurity that it's going to be exploring. And I also lived through the cultural phenomenon that really instigated all of this. Like, I lived through the knocked up era, which really feels like what this wants to explore. So I will be interested if it really comes at it from a modern perspective and opens up a more nuanced modern conversation, or if it falls into some of these pitfalls that look like they could potentially be there on the blurb. Either way, I think we're definitely going to see a lot of conversation around this book, if nothing else because it was a book of the month selection, but I will be interested to read it and join in on that conversation for sure. So we'll be very interested to see what we end up getting here, but it's been receiving a lot of positive buzz and is just another indicator in some ways that we're seeing the resurgence of a lot of these conversations that we were having in the 2000s, or the kind of fallout of a lot of these trends and conversations that we were having in the 2000s, which is just extra ironic or a full circle moment because Prep came out in the 2000s. So moving on, we have another book of the month selection, Camp Zero by Michelle Min Sterling. This is billed as Station 11 meets The Power, which is kind of what's getting me over the dystopian hump. I know in that kind of everything is new again conversation, or the kind of cycling of trends, we've been seeing a lot of conversation recently about dystopias and how dystopias fell by the wayside. If you've been with me for a second, you know I don't really love dystopias because I kind of like escaping the sad of reality in a lot of ways, or I guess I should say I like a different flavor of sad. Dystopias often come with like a sci-fi angle, a futuristic angle, and it feels like I'm kind of trapped in this inevitability of the bad and kind of moving toward disorder and chaos, which the universe naturally moves to, but I like to live in a delusion sometimes, and dystopias remove that delusion. And this dystopia adds the extra layer of the climate crisis and climate crisis fallout. So while it mentions Station 11, which is one of my favorite books and I do need to reread, there's a part of me that wonders if it's going to have a little bit of flavor of like How High We Go in the Dark as well, which I admittedly loved, even if it shouldn't have been something I loved, because it did have those elements of dystopia and it was dealing with the fallout of a pandemic. And I seem to like to ostrich myself in terms of not necessarily engaging with narratives that directly interrogate some of the things that scare me the most. About real life, I should say. I guess I have to accept them gravitating toward a lot more horror. Maybe the ghosts are less scary than the climate crisis to me. I don't know. But this seemingly follows two characters who are escaping, one to spy, one seeking to flee his kind of family legacy, and Rose, one of our protagonists, is aiming to spy on the architect. And the fact that presumably he, is referred to, I believe, exclusively in the blurb as the architect, kind of clues me in as a reader that something is not quite as it seems. So according to the blurb, this is looking at the intersection of gender, class, and migration in the climate crisis, and presumably there may be, I'm getting cult vibes. We'll see if that is true, but there were cult vibes in Station 11 as well, though admittedly less cult than I thought when I first read it. And then for my Grumpy Sunshine fans, we have What the Hex, sequel to Go Hex Yourself by Jessica Clare. I admittedly haven't gotten to Go Hex Yourself yet, but What the Hex follows Penny, who wants nothing more than to be a familiar. However, there isn't a great need for familiars right now because everyone already kind of has one, except for William, who has been banned from having a familiar due to a prior indiscretion undisclosed, and that forces him to enlist Penny's help, even if her enthusiasm kind of chafes against his surliness. However, presumably forced proximity will win out, and kissing does come into play. So I really do need to jump on this series, because even though it's not as much enemies to lovers, which I believe book 1 is, which admittedly is one of my favorite tropes when done well, this has the kind of grumpy sunshine that I think I'm going to be really attracted to. So we'll definitely keep this on my list and report back eventually. And then we are finally to the end of April 4th with One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. I believe this is a traditionally published re-release of one of the other books from the author of the Atlas 6, presumably following that success. And it follows two scions of rival magical families and the crimes and criminal empires of those magical families. So it feels like it's going to be a little bit of like magic mafia romance, potentially, a little bit Romeo and Juliet, but don't quote me on anything because I haven't read it. I just anticipate it being a little buzzy following the success of the Atlas 6, which I still need to read. And speaking of things I still need to read, moving on to April 11th, which is most importantly my friend Mandy's birthday, so happy birthday Mandy if you are watching. But we have the sequel to Aphrodite and the Duke by J.J. McAvoy, Verity and the Forbidden Suitor. This follows the sister of our eponymous Duke from the first book, and she crosses paths with the doctor who saved her brother's life, Theodore, who is a darling of society, even if he can never be a full part of society due to the fact that he is the bastard son of a Marquess. Now, I mentioned the saving of her brother's life part, even though it is a spoiler in some way. I was spoiled too, don't worry. However, it's giving me a little bit of Marrying Winterbourne vibes from Lisa Kleypas's Marrying Winterbourne, and most people I know who have read that book love that book. I love that book, so I will be interested to see if this has the same kind of levels of pining, but we will definitely see. And then we have Promises Stronger Than Darkness by Charlie Jane Anders, which Katie mentioned in our discussion the other day. This is the last in the Victories Greater Than Death series. While I admittedly am behind and haven't started this series yet, it's sci-fi, and the vibe I'm getting from the blurbs and the covers is a little bit space opera as well. So definitely really intriguing, and if Katie has recommended it, definitely something that is going to stay on my radar as well. So here it is for your radar. And then a little bit out of left field, admittedly, A Guide to Midwestern Conversation by Taylor K. Phillips. This is a novelty humor book, but I'm admittedly a sucker for some of those clickbaity articles about Midwestern conversation, and I will probably check this out to see if it's worth being a stocking stuffer later this year. And then because the 11th is pretty light on releases, we're moving on to April 18th with The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. This is following a woman who has kind of lost her identity and is only defining herself in relation to others, whether it be wife or mother. And amidst this kind of depression and loss of self, she is being visited by the ghost of a crying woman. And as she starts going to therapy, she starts kind of untangling her family's history and realizes that the other women of her family have also been visited by by what she comes to realize is La Llorona. So it feels like it's going to be exploring intergenerational trauma, intergenerational curses, and identity amidst this legend. And then we have The Fiancé Farce by Alexandra Bellafleur, which I am ecstatic for because it is a modern marriage of convenience book, and I love a marriage of convenience. And this follows a young woman who works at a bookstore and has been kind of staving off her family's questions regarding her love life by inventing a girlfriend, but this girlfriend is based on the cover model of one of her favorite romances until this cover model shows up and is the heir to this publishing company and needs to get married in order to secure her inheritance. So when Gemma the heiress meets Tansy, it seems like a perfect situation as they've already presumably been fake dating for a while, and the situation will be mutually beneficial for both of them as Gemma will get her inheritance and Tansy could really use money to help revitalize the family bookstore. But as usual, feelings get involved and the line between reality and fiction start to blur. So very, very excited for a modern marriage of convenience. And this was actually one of the titles that I was most nervous about as the HarperCollins strike kept dragging on. And obviously I'm still trying to catch up with a lot of that in some ways, but I've been really looking forward to this title. And then we have Sisters of the Lost Nation by Nick Medina, which follows a young woman trying to solve the mystery of the women and girls going missing on her reservation, and it is part thriller and part like paranormal horror. So I'm very interested to see the kind of bleeding of reality and mythology in here, and I'm wondering if that bleeding will follow a similar kind of tone to something like Empire of Wild by Sherry Demeline, or will go in a new direction. And then basically immediately contradicting myself yet again after I went on that whole kind of spiel about not loving narratives or books that kind of explore things or tragedies or something that feels a little too close to current kind of anxieties in the world. With that in mind, we have Pathogenesis, A History of the World in 8 Plagues by Jonathan Kennedy. Now, even though I don't really know if I'm ready for plague narratives that live in the kind of current moment and current climate, and I'm sure this will inevitably touch on the current moment and current climate, admittedly, I am still very interested, especially in social history and these kind of moments of change. And for a broad thesis with no backing at this moment, we often see things like plagues kind of as a precursor to great social change or in combination with great social change, whether it be in combination with other factors as well or not. So I will hypothesize that this will touch on things like the Black Death and the Spanish influenza, but I'm very interested to see where things kind of mirror our current reality, what the potential outcomes of some of these ideologies are, but also to see if people have behaved differently inherently in the past. This also aligns with my interest in kind of like micro histories or like really zoomed in looks at something, especially when it is social history or kind of looking at larger structures rather than like say battles. So we'll see what conclusions that comes to. And honestly, I think that its reception and how it's talked about in the current moment will be as interesting as anything as well. And then we have The Double Life of Vincent Yu, which is about a graphic novelist who is writing a graphic novel based on his upbringing in Chinatown in the 1980s, but he's struggling to finish the series and he starts to interject from the current day in a way that reveals a darker backstory. So I'm wondering if this is going to be or feel like a more adult kind of American-born Chinese. That being said, I don't think it's listed as a graphic novel, so I will be interested to know if there are illustrations. There isn't an illustrator listed, but I will be interested to see if there is any visual storytelling implemented within the narrative as well, and if there's not, how that will be communicated within the text. Will it follow something like Interior Chinatown, which obviously isn't a movie, but still follows a lot of narrative structures of a script, even as it's injecting a lot of absurdism. So I will be interested in the form of this storytelling for sure, whether more mixed medium or pure prose, how that prose is kind of navigated, because it also does feel like it's going to explore this idea of narrative as a coping mechanism and this kind of fantasy world that's been built out, but also then how we can work through it to kind of deal with some of those darker truths. but again, I haven't read it, so I don't really know, now do I? But I will be interested to find out. And then we have Adelaide by Genevieve Wheeler, which is another book of the month selection, and it follows 26-year-old Adelaide, who has moved to London, and amidst the whirl of this, she falls in love with charming Englishman Rory, who she views as the one, even if he's not great at communicating and he doesn't seem to prioritize her. But when Rory is rocked by an unexpected tragedy, Adelaide kind of puts everything on hold to be there for him and loses herself a little bit in the process. So this definitely doesn't feel like it is going to be a romance. I don't know how you could kind of position a hero like that on the blurb and have him be redeemable, but I definitely think it is going to explore some really real truths about what we kind of give up and where we kind of turn people into who we want them to be rather than who they are, what kind of love we accept for ourselves, and what we romanticize and what we're worth. Without looking at any reviews or hearing any real concrete buzz based on people's reading experience, I'm definitely getting a sense that this would be great for fans of Sally Rooney, which I admittedly am. I also think it's interesting because the cover admittedly reads a little bit more poetry to me, specifically a brand of poetry aimed at women in their 20s. So I will be interested to see if the novel feels like it is interrogating similar ideas and themes, if that cover is in conversation with what the book is exploring, I should say, and if that's an extra layer of commentary, or if it's just a coincidence to draw people in. And then moving back to nonfiction for a second and zoomed in history, we have The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder by David Grann. This is the author of The Killers of the Flower Moon, and this is following a shipwreck. I am admittedly really aware of boat books because my friend Mandy, whose birthday was just on the 11th, loves a boat book, and I love a kind of breakdown of social norms book, and this feels like it's going to fit the bill both ways. We are, ironically enough, reading Just Kids The Night Ship for book club next month. It's really not ironic if you think about it because Mandy loves boat books and we all love Just Kid, so we'll see how we respond to that book. I was actually interested to see in the blurb if this book was going to be based on the same shipwreck that novel is based on, but it's not. But it follows the wreckage and aftermath of a ship, The Wager, and it talks about how a group of the crew get aboard a kind of makeshift lifeboat that they have put together and are greeted as heroes upon their arrival until a few other survivors of this wreckage wash up and say, actually, all of those people were involved with a mutiny, and there is this more convoluted story that starts to come out. And in trying to get to the truth of it, either side could be risking a hanging if lying. So I'm very interested in this for its a kind of exploration of the human condition, or as the blurb talks about it, kind of human behavior at extremes, which is definitely something I'm always interested in. And then we have Symphony of Secrets, which follows the preeminent scholar of a specific composer. He is approached by the foundation for this composer as they have potentially found the lost famous opera of this composer. However, as this scholar and the board member, who is also one of the descendants of the composer, start to dig into this work and the history surrounding this composer more, they find that there may be more to the story and that this composer may have had more help on this opera than initially believed, that it may not be his work completely, if at all. And the blurb does mention a 1920s timeline, so it seems like we're going to be moving and weaving in and out of this story, seeing what our contemporary timeline is unearthing, and then seeing the truth of it reflected in the historical timeline. And in the historical timeline, the composer at the heart of this has teamed up with Josephine Reed, who is a young Black prodigy related to music. So then it also becomes a question of artistic legacy and whose stories get told. I haven't read Slocum's work before, but I know he also wrote The Violin Conspiracy, and that this book is listed as a thriller and a mystery, so I'm very interested in this kind of subgenre of musical mystery and very interested in the exploration of artistic legacy for sure. And then we have A Sleight of Shadows by Kat Howard, which is the sequel to 2017's An Unkindness of Magicians. Luckily, before I was laid off, I had just downloaded a discounted copy of An Unkindness of Magicians, which I read when it came out in 2017, and I admittedly loved, but I don't remember a whole lot about it. I know it was kind of like dueling magicians. I believe at the time it was kind of billed for fans of the Night Circus, but was a lot more kind of like urban fantasy and feel. I know my book club read it before I joined them, and they didn't like it, but I really did. I know that they had some complaints, I believe, because they told me about it, about like the thinness of the world, but I felt like it was really active and propulsive and driven by the characters, and I didn't necessarily need the fantasy world drawn out in the same way. I believed that the structure and the world building existed in the background and that I was being given what I needed for the story being told. I think I've established since then with my book club too, though, that I react to world building and fantasies a lot differently. I like high fantasies, but I'm also a little bit more tolerant in fantasies that are a little looser, and I'm willing to go with the world building a little bit more. I think the most recent example of this, at least within my book club, is we just read The Book Eaters, and they reacted to it a lot differently than I did in terms of the world building. So it's something I'm definitely keeping my eye on, but all that being said, I'm still very excited for this book. So I need to go back and reread the first and see what we're gonna get here, but I really like Howard's voice. And then we have Greek Lessons, the newest translated work from Han Kang, author of The Vegetarian and Human Acts, and I admittedly plan on picking this up purely on that legacy alone. To my interpretation of the blurb, it's following a student and teacher in a Greek class, the student who has lost their voice, the teacher who is losing their vision, and there is some kind of connection for them in this sadness. This feels like it's going to be a slightly stiller novel, especially compared to The Vegetarian. The Vegetarian did have a lot of that still tenseness though, so I don't think it's a total departure, but it feels like this might align a little bit more with Human Acts, but it feels like the grief that was a lot more present and forward in that book may be a little bit more settled and even in this one. So I'll be very interested to see how it exists within the context of her other work and what it's exploring for sure. And then we have If I See You Again Tomorrow by Robbie Couch, which is about a young man living the same day over and over until one day a new boy appears. And Clark, our protagonist, decides to throw all caution to the wind and go on a bunch of errands with this guy. And amidst this stagnation, he definitely doesn't anticipate falling in love, especially because how can he fall in love when he knows tomorrow he'll just wake up and it will be the same thing over again? So it feels like it may be a combination of they both die at the end and opposite of always, but I guess we'll have to read to find out. Okay, and then we are finally moving on to April 25th. The first release I have my eye on is I Am My Country by Keenan Oren. This is a short story collection, and what's drawing me to this specific collection, which will be no surprise to most of you, is from the blurb it says, Keenan Oren's playful stories conjure dreamlike worlds of talking animals, flying houses, and omniscient prayer calls to examine humanity's unfaltering pursuit of hope in even the darkest circumstances. So I love me some hope right now especially, but I definitely love me some weird dreamlike worlds. So I'm very excited to see what we get here and definitely have it on my list for short stories for the year, which I need to get going on. And then because I am not tired of fairies yet by any means, one of my most anticipated for the month, which may already be ready for me at the library, even though I double checked and it looks like it does come out at the end of the month. So I don't know what's going on there. I guess we'll see tomorrow when I go to pick it up if it's true that it's there, but the book is That Selfsame Metal by Brittany Ann Williams, and it follows Joan, a young sword maker in Elizabethan London who helps outfit members of Shakespeare's troupe. But because her family is also descended from Orisha, she's also capable of seeing the Fae, and this power is also useful in her sword making because it allows her to manipulate metal. But she's just used to kind of keeping an eye out for the Fae presence in London, but then Fae attacks are on the uptick and she's drawn into both human and Fae politics. So I'm excited for this for probably all of the reasons you're expecting. Fae, Elizabethan London, Shakespeare, a strong female protagonist, the fact that there's romance mentioned anywhere in the blurb or in the description, I'm intrigued. So I'm very, very excited to see what we're gonna get here, especially because I haven't read anything personally that took this kind of fantasy twist to Elizabethan London in a long time, and I definitely haven't read it with a Black protagonist. So I am so, so excited for this, and will hopefully be reporting back very soon. And then do I even need to tell you that Emily Henry's Happy Place is coming out this month? Emily Henry's Happy Place is coming out this month. Now, this is one being released in hardcover first, I'm pretty sure, which was all a buzz on the internet at one point. Not really surprising to me in terms of the popularity of her books, especially as in part 2 of this, in early reception of this, I'm seeing a lot of people kind of caution readers that this is very different from Book Lovers, which honestly makes sense because Book Lovers was different from People You Meet on Vacation, which was different from Beach Read, but this seems to be leaning a little bit more into the chick lit side of things from what I'm hearing. Now, I would argue that all of her books kind of have to some extent. Like, yes, there is still a very heavy romance focus in the books, but it's not the romance driving the books, it's the development of the protagonist driving the book. I don't know, we'll see. But this follows a couple who have broken up, but are pretending they haven't broken up for one last vacation with their friends. So we'll see how that kind of develops, because on its face, that sounds pretty romance, especially because there is inevitably going to be an only one bed. But we'll see how it plays out, and Emily Henry has been getting a lot of really deserved love recently, so I will be interested to see how the reception of this book fits into the larger conversation around her work and kind of public perception of her work as well. So definitely keeping my eye out for it, and I think this is also positioning itself to move into a big book for the summer. And then we have Just As You Are by Camille Kellogg, which is a modern sapphic Pride and Prejudice set at a queer magazine, and honestly, that's all I need to know. I will be jumping in on that alone. So excited for that. Even amidst the kind of oversaturation of Pride and Prejudice retellings, I really had to step back recently, and it takes something really special to kind of spark my interest in terms of Pride and Prejudice retellings, so you know that this, or at least I think this, has the potential to be really special, and it definitely feels like it's going to have something different to say. So it feels like it's going to be a little looser than a beat for beat retelling, which honestly I kind of prefer. So I will be very interested to see kind of how it tackles it, whether it's just the kind of broad overarching dynamic, or whether we have a little bit more interpretation of the source material there. So I guess what I'm saying is we'll see if it's more plot related or marketing related in terms of the parallels, but either way, interested to see what we're gonna get there. And then finally, we have A Rogue's Rules for Seduction by Eva Lee. This is the third in the Rules for Scoundrels series. I am admittedly behind because of the strike. I have not yet read How the Wallflower Was Won, but this series was started with The Good Girl's Guide to Rakes, which I talked about way back when, before season 2 of Bridgerton, in my rake off video, and it started with an interrupted wedding and a jilted bride. And so in this book, we are swooping back around to that couple, and I am anticipating a good amount of groveling will be involved. So I'm very excited to see how this series both continues and wraps up, but very excited for this one for sure. And with that, we are finished with April. I do not know how long it will have been for you at this point in the process, but for me, I am tired of my own voice, and will probably be tired of my own voice twice over by the time this process is fully completed. So thank you for hanging out with me this long. If you've stayed till now, truly appreciate it. Would love to know what you're excited about. Like I said before, whether we've talked about it already, or if it's something I haven't mentioned. Would admittedly appreciate any like you want to throw my way. But again, thanks for hanging out. Read something good, and yeah, bye.